transcend communism. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Signed the first agreement ever to eliminate an entire class of U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons. We have made history.
During the Cold War, the U.S. faced many challenges, but once the war ended, those challenges did not stop. After their victory in the Cold War, the U.S. still faced trouble from the Soviet Union. The U.S. bled the Soviet Union and Russia of all their money, thus starting the fall of the Soviet Union. Here we see the Russian politician Mikhail Gorbachev. He transformed Soviet politics and tried to save the Soviet Union from falling after the Cold War. Even before the Cold War, there were long-standing economic issues in Russia that made it hard to sustain its commitments to the world. In 1987, Gorbachev began reducing Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, and in 1989, every communist state in Europe was forced to turn into a non-communist regime. During the Cold War and at the end of it, the president at the time was Ronald Reagan. At the end of the Cold War, Reagan did what he could to restore the U.S., and by doing this, he began to meet with the Russian politician Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan was skeptical of Gorbachev in power, but he slowly became convinced that the Soviet leader was sincere. At a meeting with Reagan and Gorbachev, Gorbachev proposed reducing nuclear arsenals on both sides by 50%. Although Reagan had commitments to the SDI program, the two powers signed a treaty eliminating nuclear forces. As the dust began to settle between the Soviet Union and the U.S., many dramatic changes began to happen in America. The popularity of Reagan's presidency deflected attention from political scandals. There were many revelations in different parts of the government, for example, the CIA. A big scandal was when the White House conceded that it had sold weapons to Iran. Money from this arms deal was illegally funneled, and many scandals followed. Once past scandals began to get covered up, and the Reagan Revolution began to fade, we entered the election of 1988. During and at the end of the Cold War, the president at the time, who was Ronald Reagan, was a Republican. After Reagan's presidency, Democrats regained control of the U.S. Senate. Hope for a Democratic president was back. The only problem was, popular Democrats refused to run for the presidency, but Michael Dukakis, a three-term Democratic governor of Massachusetts, decided to run. Michael's opponent was George H.W. Bush, who was a Republican. Many believed that because the Democrats had regained control of the U.S. Senate, that their party had a very good chance at winning the 1988 election, and it helped that their opponent, George H.W. Bush, failed to spark public enthusiasm. Nobody thought that someone from the Republican Party had a chance at winning the 1988 election, but at a Republican convention, Bush staged a major turnaround by going after Dukakis. Bush tried Dukakis on many social and cultural stances, and Dukakis failed to come up with responses. In November, George H.W. Bush came out victorious with a 54% popular vote and 426 electoral votes. The end of the Cold War did not mean the end of challenges for America. As we saw in this video, the U.S. still faced many struggles at the end of the Cold War. But world powers met and tried to resolve issues. As we saw, Gorbachev and Reagan came up with a treaty that eliminated nuclear forces. Reagan's popularity during his presidency helped distract citizens from scandals that were going on inside the White House and the government. And after Reagan's presidency, once the Reagan Revolution faded, we saw that another Republican came to presidency, even though Democrats had hope.